Survey design, a quantitative procedure, presented by Courtney Berry. The objectives of this presentation are to define what is survey design research, how did it develop and what are the controversies, and when do researchers use a survey design. We will describe the types of survey designs, key characteristics, and the steps in conducting survey design research. Finally, we will identify the pros and cons of questionnaires and surveys, the potential ethical issues, and the criteria used for evaluating survey designs. We will do this through the lens of an overview article entitled Essential Standards for Preparing Secondary Content Teachers to Effectively Teach Students with Mild Disabilities in Included Settings by Janice Griskovic and Sheila Rusinka. First, we must define the meaning of the survey design. In his book, Educational Research, Planning, Conducting, and Evaluating Quantitative and Qualitative Research, Cresswell identifies survey design as the procedures in quantitative research in which investigations administer a survey to a sample or to the entire population of people to describe the attitudes, opinions, behaviors, or characteristics of the population. The characteristics of a survey design include collecting quantitative data through the use of questionnaires or interviews, analyzing the data in order to test research questions and describe trends that emerge, and finally, interpreting the data by relating the results to previous research studies. Survey designs can describe trends that can possibly affect policy change, provide information in order to evaluate programs, or identify beliefs and attitudes as they relate to individuals. The use of survey designs are of interest to everyone from policymakers to teachers in the classroom. Of the quantitative studies, we see experimental, correlational, and our study, the survey design. Let's look at the history of survey design. Survey designs emerged in the early 1800s with surveys in the field of education. Shortly after, we saw some of our first controversies around the legitimacy of surveys. In the late 1800s, surveys of children and social problems began to emerge. Further controversy arose around the demonstration of feasibility. In the early 1900s, the American census originated. Additional controversy arose in the mid-1900s around the emphasis of random sampling. From that controversy, we now find that most research designs emphasize the importance of having a random sample. And in current times, we see that survey designs can now be nationally funded and are often delivered through electronic means. When determining whether or not to use a survey design among the quantitative studies, one may first ask the question, is there a treatment involved? A treatment is something that is typically administered within an experiment. So we may further ask ourselves, is the treatment tightly controlled by the researcher? In order to identify the type of experimental research to conduct, experimental studies test the relationship between independent and dependent variables. Should we answer no to our question, is there a treatment? Then we must ask ourselves, is the primary purpose examination of relationships? If the answer is yes, then a correlational design is used. Correlational designs are used to relate two or more variables to see if they influence each other, as well as to make predictions. If the answer is no, then we find ourselves utilizing a survey design. Survey designs describe a phenomenon for a specific purpose. In our research article, the authors chose a survey design in order to identify which of the Council for Exceptional Children standards could be used to better prepare general education teachers to meet the needs of special education students within the general education setting. There are two types of survey designs. First, let's look at cross-sectional. Cross-sectional survey designs examine current attitudes, beliefs, opinions, or practices. It can compare two or more educational groups. It can measure the community needs, evaluate a program, and can also be conducted on a large-scale assessment. Our research study is cross-sectional, as it is measuring a point in time. The survey is not repeated over time to evaluate the possibility of changing beliefs. Within a longitudinal study, we may study trend changes within the same population that occur over time. We may study changes within a cohort identified by a common characteristic, or we can examine changes within a panel of people. The characteristics of a survey design include the sampling, the data, the instrument, and the response. Within the sampling, we look at the bigger picture of the population. The population then results in the target sample, the individuals that can be obtained as possible respondents. And finally, this results in the sample, or the individuals that were studied. Please note that we can survey an entire population when the population is small enough. When considering data, we can look at questionnaires and interviews. Questionnaires can be mailed or web-based, while interviews can be conducted in a one-on-one setting, in a focus group setting, or over the telephone. When considering the instrument, we may write different types of questions, or it may include different types of questions, should we choose to use an instrument previously created. If we write our own types of questions, we'll want to utilize strategies for good question construction. And finally, we'll want to perform a pilot test of the questions. When considering our response, we want to look at the rate of the response. We can increase the rate of response by notifying respondents prior to, by following up with respondents, by making sure that our respondents have an interest in the study, as well as providing incentives. When we look at the bias within our response, we can consider a wave analysis. In a wave analysis, we consider the responses that have been received more recently as opposed to the responses received when the study was initially begun. When considering the process of a survey design, we must first ask ourselves, is a survey design the best option for our research in order to answer our question or answer the purpose of the study? Should we answer no, we can consider a different design, such as experimental, correlational, grounded theory, ethnographic, narrative research, mixed methods, or action research. If we answer yes, that a survey design is the best option, we can look at the research question and hypothesis. Are we describing trends, possibly comparing groups, or maybe even relating variables? Within the population target and sample, we want to make sure that ultimately we have that random sampling. The purpose of our study that we're looking at was to identify the knowledge, skills, and dispositions essential for preparing secondary content teachers to effectively teach students with mild disabilities. The population of our research study included all secondary teachers working with special education students. 3,060 secondary teachers were identified as potential participants, with the sample including 510 people. The final sample was approximately 87% of the initial target. When we look at the types and procedures, again we'll consider a cross-sectional or longitudinal study, as well as whether to utilize questionnaires or interviews. We chose a cross-sectional approach where we utilized the questionnaires via electronic means. When considering the instrument itself, we want to take into account the reliability and the validity. The reliability is the extent to which repeatedly measuring the same property produces the same result, and validity is the extent to which a survey question measures the property it intends to measure. When looking at the types of questions, we can consider an open or closed-ended question. The structure and wording of the question will always be important in making sure that the question we're asking is clear to the participant. And finally, we want to look at the reference period. Is it for a moment in time? Is it over time? Is it something that we're considering on a daily basis or a weekly basis? That will impact the response that we give as an option. Within our study, we looked at closed-ended questions, questions that had simple answers that were identified quickly. The structure and wording came from the Council for Exceptional Children's standards previously identified, and the reference period was not applicable. Within the response format, we'll look at the categories as well as the frequency or occurrence. And we also want to take into account if the questionnaire is self-administered or possibly a survey is self-administered, or if there requires somebody there to note the response. And finally, the pilot study is to test and train for the reliability and validity of our instrument. Unfortunately, within our study that we're looking at, the authors did not identify whether or not a pilot study was used, nor did they discuss the reliability and validity. However, because they are utilizing standards that have been previously researched, it is noted that they feel a level of comfort. Further in the process, we discuss how to administer the survey design. This is the most time-consuming step of our process. In an effort to obtain a high response rate, we're going to hopefully pre-notify the participants. We'll follow up with those who may not have responded. We most definitely want to identify our participants who are interested or have a vested interest in completing the survey. And finally, if necessary, incentives can be offered. For our particular survey, there was a high vested interest by the participants, as the sample was identified through individuals who had previously signed up for the Council for Exceptional Children organization or website and had identified themselves as secondary teachers with experience in the field of special education. No incentives were necessary, and with a high response rate of close to 88%, there was limited follow-up required. When looking at bias, we can consider the wave analysis. Unfortunately, within our study, a wave analysis was not conducted. Once we've administered our survey, it's time to analyze the data. Part of this process can include incomplete or missing data and how the researchers chose to work around this, how the researchers located errors, and did they give any particular questions more or less weight than other questions. Within our study, the researchers identified the individuals who had not completed the study, and their results were removed from the final outcome. With regard to the weight of questions, they broke them down into 8 different constructs, with each question carrying the same amount of weight. Within the process of analyzing it, we go to the coding, where the results are looked at for some similarities or differences. Finally, we draw conclusions, which are often reflected in a visual representation within the report. Within our research article, the article followed the standard layout by including the purpose, the rationale, the method, the results, the discussion, and the conclusion. In order to relay the data in a simple manner, the authors included tables and narratives. The authors also included the limitations and future implications. The survey procedure was identified within the method section, and the discussion section included the generalizability of the results, as well as referenced previous research articles. When determining what type of survey to use, there are pros and cons that can be taken into consideration. For questionnaires, they can be mailed or electronic. Mailed questionnaires tend to be economical, however, can also be impersonal. Electronic questionnaires are efficient, yet carry bias. The bias of our study includes that it was only emailed to secondary members of the Council for Exceptional Children. This eliminates the opportunity for anyone outside of the organization to have input. When considering interviews, individual interviews can be personal and carry a high response rate. However, there's no anonymity, and there can be bias with regard to how the interviewer reflects the results. Focus groups are interactive, however, require a consensus, and if there is a strong personality amongst the focus group, you may not hear the voice of all members. Finally, telephone interviews increase the accessibility, as location does not matter. Yet the nonverbal communication is lacking, and telephone interviews tend to carry a negative connotation. When discussing survey design, we must look at the ethical issues. When collecting data, we need to consider the appropriateness of the incentives that may be offered, as well as the safety of both the individuals collecting the data, as well as the safety of the respondents. We should also analyze the results with confidentiality. Oftentimes, respondents are not identified by names, however, identified by numbers. Reporting the surveys, it's best to destroy the surveys. When considering the ethical issues of survey design, it's of note that often survey research is exempt from IRB approval unless it addresses sensitive information or populations, such as individuals with special or disabilities or minors. When evaluating survey design, Creswell offers up criteria. Authors should describe the target population and how the sample was identified. Authors should describe the type of survey and the details of the instrument used. Authors should report on the validity and the reliability of the instrument. And authors should discuss the procedures of administering the survey. Finally, the authors of this type of survey design study should provide the approach to analyzing the data to determine the results. When considering our article, the authors described the population, the survey, as well as the procedures used. Unfortunately, the authors did not go into details with regard to the validity or reliability, nor did they provide the approach with which they analyzed the data. The approach they provided was solely to identify the mean of each response item and to determine their results from there. References utilized in order to create this presentation are the 3 controversies in the history of survey sampling from Survey Methodology, Educational Research, Planning, Conducting, and Evaluating Quantitative and Qualitative Research by Creswell, our sample article for the example research of essential standards for preparing secondary content teachers to effectively teach students with mild disabilities in included settings, and finally a resource from the University of